Oh my gosh.
La concejal Clarisa Peña, ahí está. Jeff Hertz. Saludos. Clarisa Peña, ahí.
Okay, we are now live.
Y el padrino. Ahí está el padrino, Lawrence Ryle.
All right. Well, thank you for the bicultural roll call there, Councillor Benton. We will call this meeting of the Intergovernmental Legislative Relations Committee to order. Everyone is present. Thank you for being here. Julian, anything we have to do in terms of announcements, or can we just get started?
I believe you can just get started, Ms. Nair. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right, our first item on the agenda is a report on the 116th Congress and new administration from Mr. O'Donnell. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sarita. Kyriakis and myself are here, so both of us can respond to questions you may have about what I say or he says, or I can comment on questions that you have. First, a couple of things about what's happening in Washington right now. I think most importantly is we don't know at this point the cabinet appointees for the agencies, departments that focus on domestic affairs. So we're waiting to see what DOT, HUD, we know Homeland Security, EPA, and I'm trying to think if there's a Department of Energy, which has some impact on domestic programs. So we're waiting to hear about those. That they could be announced this week. If you're familiar with the fact that the president has announced his economic team, and that's pretty complete at this point. I would say this, that one of the benefits of Janet Yellen being the Treasury Secretary is that she has been a strong supporter of stimulus spending for state and local governments during this period of the COVID pandemic. So we expect to see her advancing that idea, and we know the president-elect is already a strong supporter of that idea. One of the things that's being discussed right now, we are in the final stages of Congress passing the Omnibus Appropriations bill for FY21. That fiscal year started back in October. According to Senator Leahy and Senator Shelby from Alabama, who's chair of the committee, they've got about 95 to 98% agreement, they say, on their side. In conversations Kyriakis and I've had with a former appropriations staffer from the House side, they feel that they're going to get this appropriations bill finished before Christmas. That is certainly their goal, because they'd like to wrap that up before the new administration comes in next year. One of the things that's being discussed right now is the idea of going back, restoring earmarks. That is not a conversation that's being had on the Senate side, but on the Democratic side, House. There are 3 women contending for the chairmanship of the Appropriations Committee, and all 3 of them have said that they would support the reintroduction of earmarks in this coming Congress. We don't know if they'll actually get around to doing that and working that out with the Senate, but it's one of the things to keep in mind as we get to the final stages of approving a federal program for the city of Albuquerque, because we should keep in mind that there may be an opportunity for earmarking again. And I would say, in terms of reflecting on how this has in the past affected the city's program, years ago, before 2008, it was fairly easy to identify priorities for the city in terms of federal programs, because you had the administration and council members identifying projects that they would like to get federal funding for. And that in many ways drove the city's federal program. There were also things like, the amount of CDBG funding the city would get, and that was an overall number that applied across the city. So that was one way that in terms of funding for grants or entitlements, that was an easy way to support funding for those kind of programs which had impact citywide. So that's kind of that is the background to what we're looking at right now. We think that the appropriations process for FY22, which is the one that we'll be working on after the new administration comes in, and that doesn't start until next October 1st, but that's what we're going to be preparing some of the city's federal program targeted to what are those federal programs that are important to you that we want the most robust funding for in FY22. We already submitted this past March and February, we submitted what the priorities were based on this year's federal program to the congressional delegation. So any questions about where we are in the process, questions about new administration or COVID, or the appropriations for FY21, which hopefully are going to get finished soon?
Thank you, John. You can either use the raise hand function or, old-fashioned raise your hand, but I see Councilor Pena has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, I just was going to comment just to say that, that was one of my things when I first got on the IGR is that, we really did our legislative request in terms of earmarks, and then worked really hard over the years to kind of shift people's thinking that it was really into grants. And now that I think we're barely starting to get it, John, we're going to switch back.
Yeah, well, let me just respond to that by saying, you know what, even in the in the old earmark regime process, there were still grant opportunities and competitive. And so we did always have a combination. In fact, when people got pretty alarmed about the elimination of earmarks, one of my thoughts was, well, we're going back to the way it was earlier than the 2000s, when there were a lot of local federal funding was done through competitive grants. It wasn't done through earmarking. Earmarking got pretty popular in the 90s. But let me say something about the earmarking thing. There was an article in the New York Times late last week or over the weekend on the opinion page about earmarking. And one of the things that Congresswoman Speaker Pelosi did about a year ago was she created a bipartisan committee to look at the modernization of the Congress, the House. And one of the recommendations they came up with was to restore earmarking. And there were Republicans on that small committee who supported the idea of returning to earmarkings. And one of the reasons why that seems to be something that has some currency, and it was reflected in the New York Times article, is because it almost forces some bipartisanship. You have members on one side of the aisle who have a project that they want funded for their district, and they like having that kind of control. And those programs, when we were last doing earmarking, they were very well vetted by congressional staff, both at the district level and Washington level. Well, those earmarks caused members on both sides of the aisle to want to cooperate with one another. And they're also a way that legislation gets passed because there's something in there for somebody. So I just say we're not sure where we are on that, but we're going to be fully prepared to go at this both ways for the city of Albuquerque, both going after the grant programs and earmarking. Now, if there are no more thoughts about this introductory material, I'd like to address the resolution, and Tom Minicucci sent me the resolution that the city council has in draft. And then there were 3 attachments. a list of federal policy priorities. That was one attachment. There was a list of potential grant applications. I think that was attachment 2. And attachment 1 was basically an articulated list of support city mission objectives, federal programs that would support city mission objectives. So we've got 4 documents that I've looked at, and I don't know if all of you have these in front of you.
John, if I could just add that, councilors and committee members, Deputy Chief Administrative Officer Nair, we just sent 2 emails. The first one, 4 emails, 3 emails. One of them was just has all the federal documents in one place. That's the first one. The second email just came in, has all the state documents on one page. And then the third one has 2 amendments that COO Rael and Chief of Staff Pooley would like to make to the state documents. So those just came in a few minutes ago.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I think for purposes of simplifying the discussion with all the material that we have, first I would say the bottom line end product for the city's federal program is to put in front of the congressional delegation the projects that are priorities for the city of Albuquerque that rely on federal funding. The other priority for the federal program is to identify those federal or those legislative issues that are priorities for the city where we want the delegation to pay attention or follow or know that the city has an interest in these legislative matters. And so I'd like to start by talking about the end product that would be based off of the resolution and 3 attachments. In February and March, we're going to be asked by the congressional delegation, each member, to submit a list of federal program accounts that identify the federal agency, the federal program account as it appears in the appropriations bill, and then the specific program area or the funding area that is under that federal program account. So we would have to name, for example, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, or in transportation, it might be the bus and bus facilities account within FTA. So that's what we prepare. That's what we prepare in March and February for the delegation, so that they have a list of those program areas that the city considers priorities. When we submit that statement of the federal program account priority, we need to have in that document that we sent, and this is a document that they send to us, so they're formatted by them. They ask us, so what's the specific reason that you're asking for this particular grant program to be funded? And under that, we like to provide some information that talks specifically about what the city has been doing as far as the background to the issue that is the reason the city is asking for this funding, and then to give them enough detail that the staff person who presents the city's priorities to the senator or the member of Congress can actually add information and say the reason why the city of Albuquerque considers this land and water conservation program important is because they want to fund this kind of a park project specifically. And that's the kind of information that we actually need in order to respond to those priorities, federal program priority funding issues that the delegation asks for. Now, if there's earmarking, what we have to be able to do, and Councilor Pena referenced this, is we have to be able to give the congressional staff enough information about the background to why that earmark is being requested, the specific project that it would fund. And in the pre-2008 days, we actually had to show them some kind of budget information or what amount the city was putting into this project, what amount was being requested in the earmark for that project. So there's a level of detail that is really important for Kyriakis and myself to have, working with city departments and with the city council, to make sure that we provide the best description possible. And then there's another level to this federal program and account funding, and that is, it really needs to be, because we can be, the sheet that the congressional delegation gives us says, so what's the priority of this project in terms of everything that's on the city's list of issues? Sometimes when it's a citywide project, it's easy to list that and say, this has a citywide impact. This is the number one priority. We don't often see citywide projects, but sometimes in transportation, that will happen. But it is important for us to have a discrete list, and that's why I will turn to the attachment number 2, which is the potential project grant applications for federal programs. What really, the listing is good, and we're glad to have this. What we need to do in order to take the next step we're going to have to take with the delegation is to develop some specific information about these specific projects that might qualify for grant funding. And this means that I think for our purposes, it would be helpful to know which ones of these might be administration priorities or council priorities, and are they citywide or are they specific district? An example of one that would be citywide would be the Double Eagle 2 Airport Economic Development, Utility, and Infrastructure funding. I'm assuming that has broad citywide impacts for economic development. But it would be useful to know which of these are citywide, which of them are maybe more specific to a district. And I proposed to Tom earlier, and I would suggest to the committee that we do this, that we go through this list of these project grant applications, which look like priority projects, that we don't have to go through these today in this discussion. But I think what we need to do with both the administration and with the council is work on this list, and this could be a follow-up meeting of the committee, where we try to identify what are the specific priorities for the city. And I don't want to constrain you by saying that there ought to only be 10 projects. But I'll say this: in terms of competitive grant funding, we know that if you're going to the Department of Transportation for a build grant or an infra grant or a transit grant, the likelihood is you probably get one of those grants. Maybe you get one in each one of those categories, but you're not probably going to get multiple ones. So that's something that we should consider in looking at what our list is going to be. Carrie,
John, maybe we'll just take a beat there. There's a lot of information. I don't want any of it to get lost. Let me first just make sure that everybody has received these documents that Tom sent out. Maybe just some nods. Okay, I don't see anybody looking lost, so that's good. Second, Councilor Pena, this is your bill, and so I do want to give you a chance to talk about it a little bit before John continues or wraps up. And so what I would suggest is we have Councilor Pena lay out anything she'd like to talk about, and if you have a suggested approach for how we move this forward, and then we can open it up for questions. Thanks. You're still on mute, Councilor.
Sorry. I stopped having that glitch, and then all of a sudden it started again with my laptop. So thank you, Madam Chair. John, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. So it sounds like, you know, kind of what I was kind of joking about earlier is that, so now we're gonna, I think what we need to do is probably maybe keep this in committee, the federal priorities bill, and keep it in committee and work on it, because I think what you're saying is we're going to have to kind of have, it's always been a two-prong approach, because it has been grants and some small earmarks, but it sounds like it's going to be kind of, you know, back, not maybe back to the way it was, but more similar to what it used to be. My only question is that, well, a couple of things. One, what if they decide not to do earmarks? So should we, you know, I would hate to put some of our priorities in the earmark section and then it not be funded because they decided not to go with the earmarks. So that's one. And then the other part of it is that, yeah, it seems like we should keep it in committee and just work to make it more comprehensive the way it used to be, because I know if you recall that we had like 20 pages before, remember, and because of the earmarks not being so big anymore, we really tried to focus on just the grant areas and what those priorities were within those grant areas. And so I just think that we probably could use a little more time to draft it and make sure that it's good. But if you can answer that question, just in case they don't do earmarks.
Well, it's a good question, Counselor, because I would suggest that we not even change the title of that section or that attachment, which says project grant applications for federal programs. We just leave it the way it is. Because if there are earmarks, those earmarks go against the federal grant program anyway. I mean, one of the things that federal agency people once in a while will complain to folks like Kyriakis and myself is, yeah, we'd like to make grants, but you know what? Congress earmarked all the money. So eventually any earmark gets charged back against an existing grant program. So we can leave the language the way it is. And
Okay.
we'll still have that flexibility.
Okay, perfect. So would you agree that we should, what would be the deadline? I know you said October, but I think I would love for it to be done. Obviously, we try to do it in advance so that we have opportunities to speak to our federal delegation ahead of time, tour them of our areas of importance. And so what do you think would be do you think we can get this out like by March?
I think, well, first of all, we get a break this year because a new administration isn't in office until January 20th. And then typical of any transition year, there's going to be mayhem here for the first couple of months after that. Because the new president will have to submit a budget, then they'll have appropriations hearings. At the same time, they'll be having cabinet secretary. Hopefully they're done by then, but they'll still probably be doing some of that. So we talked with Tom about this earlier today and said, you know what? We think that your resolution is in very good shape. We only talked about 2 minor changes to it. And we think that on the priorities when it comes to projects, that we have time to work with the council and the administration on refining that list. So streamlining it, refining it, however you want to talk about that, but that we can get the detail and the priorities listed. And while I said before that maybe, you know, we're looking at, you got to maybe boil it down to 1 in each program area. There's nothing that says this is not an art, or this is not a science, this is an art. You know, I would recommend that you have like 3 priorities per area. It allows for different grant programs that you can apply for, and also under, if there is earmarking, in the earmarking things, sometimes those go into different program accounts within appropriations. So there's flexibility. So I would say that if we could work on this between now and the middle of January, that it would be good to have a final product by the end of January or by the middle of February. Kyriakis, do you have any thought on that?
I think that timeline is good. I think, as soon as we can get it done in the next Congress, the better. As you know, the appropriations process will start in March, mid-March. The administration typically submits its budget request in early February, but as you indicated, John, that might be delayed, as is typically done when a new administration comes in. So I think, striving towards the end of January, early February makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, John and Kyriakis. I see Councilor Benton has a question.
Hi, yeah, John. So I think the format of our resolution, that's all fine. I think I've spoken to you about this and I can't remember exactly your answer. So I was hoping I could hear it again. We have, these bills, both this one and the state legislative one, we've all got a lot of programs. We've all got a lot of priorities and issues that we're working on. And, it seems like it would be helpful with this larger list that you've just received, and I haven't reviewed it all of what was prepared, but that be a starting point, and to have you advise us, you and Kyriakis, as to just where, we're relying on your expertise, where are our best odds to focus on these, because I think this bill, correct me if I'm wrong, is used with every member as a sort of a cover letter of sorts. And then there are more details in terms of what our programs are or could be if we're applying for a new one. And that's the purpose of it, in a sense. It's an official cover letter by the entire government of Albuquerque that this is what we care about. And we'd like you as our representatives to work on, correct?
Yes. And I think your point, Counselor, about us providing you some advice is, Kyriakis and I have started discussing this sheet, the attachment, which is the project grant applications for federal programs. There are some that are maybe more likely than others to get funding. And then I would have to also say that, for example, the first one on attachment to the continued development of Alameda Drain Parkway and low impact development stormwater facilities. My point that I made in the margin there, the note was, and what role is a MAFCA playing in this? Or does a MAFCA have a role in this? I would assume they do because of their stormwater management or stormwater flood issues. Their responsibilities for those. So what I said to Tom earlier, and back to your point, Counselor, I think what Kyriakis and I can do is take this list and not take anything off of it, but list what the possible funding sources are, and then maybe say something about the chances of, to the degree we can say this, maybe say something about the likelihood of funding for that type of project, or there may not actually be a federal source for this. So we can do that.
Madam Chair, that's really what I would find helpful, and it would seem that your guidance and Mr. Haran's guidance on the legislature is similar to where should we expend our efforts, because we know there's first of all, there are a lot of uncertainties. So I should probably ask you, what's the chance of the Democrats winning 2 seats in Georgia? He's probably not going to pronounce it.
I'm sorry, I have to go get a cup of coffee. I'll be back.
A cup of something else. But anyway, but no, with these uncertainties, all kidding aside, we know that, there are probably 2 scenarios, right? One would be different on many of these programs than the other in terms of the Senate.
Yeah, and I would say this back to something I said earlier, and I don't want to go too far off your point, but there's going to be another COVID bill. And there could be, I think the likelihood of one before the end of the year is still a big question mark. There's a group of, and the reason I bring up COVID is because actually some of these things that you have listed, again, depending on the connection that we can make between those projects and whatever eligibility requirements the new administration has for the next COVID bill, some of this might get some funding. Some of these might be eligible for some funding. So that's also in play. I just want to say this as an aside, there's a group of bipartisan senators who've come out with about a $906 billion COVID bill that they just announced today. There's about 100, I think Kyriakis, it's 160 billion in there for state and local governments. So I think the chances of there being funding for state and local government in another bill is very good. And you've got Janet Yellen, as I said at the opening, pushing for this. You've also got the president, who's also talked about the importance of this. And towards the last few days before the election, Mitch McConnell even talked about, he did say that he saw the importance of some funding for state and local government in the next COVID bill, but not on the scale that Speaker Pelosi has in the House Heroes bill, which was 426. Once she cut it back, it was 426 billion. And McConnell said, I think there ought to be funding, but I don't know that all cities or counties have the same need for that assistance. And I think he's probably thinking of places like the Scottsdale, Arizona, although they are really impacted by tourism, as a lot of places in New Mexico. But do they need the same level of funding that, say, Phoenix with a central city needs? So back to the point about the list, I think Kyriakis and I can also look at this list in terms of where there may be the likelihood of some funding through the COVID bill. That wouldn't necessarily be something that would appear in your documentation for your request, but to your point about providing you some advice on this.
That in a sense is a lot more immediate than this. This is sort of a long range, but no, I mean, I think, yeah, you could look at it through both of those lenses, and that would be very helpful to us.
Okay.
Thank you. So
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, thanks. It sounds like we have consensus that we'll keep this bill sort of cooking, continue to work with John and Kyriakos and get ideas either directly to them or through Tom, and bring this up again at the next meeting. Is that acceptable, Councilor Pena? Okay, great. Anything?
Sarita, can I add something there? I'll tell you what would really be helpful to us in this process is if Kyriakis and myself can talk, if some of these relate specifically to a city department, and I expect many of them do, all of them do, that we might need to talk to that city department person about some specifics, some detail. And so we would want to be able to work with all of you on making sure, Sarita, that we get to the right person and we don't, we don't waste anybody's time, but we get some information when we need it in order to have enough there that's got meat on the bones.
Absolutely, John. I just say coordinate that through Isaac Padilla, and he can help wayfind and also make sure that we're all on the same page. Councilor Pena?
And I just might add that some of these priorities that are listed are other councilors' priorities that aren't on the IGR. So you may need to talk to them when you started talking about the drainage. It's probably a conversation with other councilors to relay that either it's a possibility or it may be somewhat of a stretch.
Okay, and we'll talk with Tom about making sure that we're in touch with the right council member on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Anything else for John and his team?
Sarita, I'll add one more thing if you don't mind.
Please.
On the resolution that's an attachment, it's 3 pages actually. And I talked with Tom about this, so I'll just flag it, that at the end of the third whereas, I suggested some language which mentions the city or the funding being available to respond to and prevent the spread of COVID-19. Since the city did do a resolution on COVID spending a while ago about the use of the flexibility of funds, I thought we should mention COVID in this resolution. And then there's some additional language on the very end of page 3 that just talks about lost revenue and sustaining critical public services also related to COVID-19. And I gave Tom that information, so he's got the specific wording there.
Thank you. And I'll take this opportunity to also thank your team for the great work in advocacy in having our city qualify for a direct allocation of CARES funding that literally saved lives, not to mention jobs. So of course, that is a top priority for the city in any future CARES funding bill.
Well, it's helpful to have you folks weigh in with the congressional delegation as you did, and for us to have those relationships with the congressional delegation. And we're going to make sure that in this next bill, that flexibility is there. And also it seems like we've been talking about another COVID bill for so long, I forget that we still didn't get the retroactive to replace lost revenue. Now that may be a train that left the station, because by the end of the year, you're supposed to expend those funds. Oh, by the way, that's a good point too. It would be very helpful to have a statement from you folks that shows how you did spend all of that money. And I'll tell you why. It's going to be very important to show the congressional delegation that all of it was spent, or even if all of it didn't get spent, if some had to be returned. But the other thing is, it also is data and information that will be important to support whatever state and local funding is being requested in this next go round.
Absolutely, and we will spend it all. There's no question in my mind.
Okay, good.
All right, well, thank you. Of course, you're welcome to stay for the remainder of the agenda, but we will move on to the next item, which is the report on the special session and the upcoming session from Joe Thompson and his team. Joe.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate being here with you. As you know, last week there was a special session. It was a week ago today.
Joe, you're frozen on my screen. I don't know if anybody else is still hearing Joe.
I don't think so.
No, he doesn't have the best internet.
You're frozen, Joe.
Well, thank you. I don't know, Bianca, if you want to pick it up for a minute, or also maybe we could text Joe and let him know.
The viability and sort of the roadblocks to projects.
There he is.
They can't see me.
And just a reminder of everybody to mute if you're not actually talking. Thanks.
Oh wait, he's getting back on.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to run over to our house here and do it inside. Maybe it'll be better. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Is that any better?
So far, yes.
Okay. I sure am sorry to have dropped that. So as you know, last week we had a special session. The legislature did just over $300 million worth of unemployment stuff, about $194 million. They also did some, I'm sorry, I don't have my notes with me. Bianca, do you have the list with you?
Yes, let me pull them up real quick.
I apologize, everyone. I just left my computer with all my notes for my presentation, and we've got 2 kids Zooming at school, and so it's sapping my bandwidth. But the long and short of it is that the legislature did do some things as it relates to the city. It's really more that, you know, the $50 million that could go for small business loans are, all those things could help our citizens, but specifically related to Albuquerque, there really wasn't anything specific to us other than we would benefit. As we're preparing now for the oncoming year, there's so much uncertainty in the air in terms of who's going to be chairing what committees. As you know, Senator Smith retired last night from the legislature. So there's going to be a new Senate Finance Committee chair. There's going to be a new chair of corporations. There's going to be a lot of new faces along with 22 new members. And so the focus that we've had coming out of the election and getting ready for next year has really been to be fundamentally sound as it relates to how we're going to interact with the legislature. We don't really know whether they'll be meeting in person or if they'll be doing a hybrid approach in terms of having some members there, some members attached virtually, whether committee meetings will be able to attend, how the public will weigh in, how we will weigh in. So we've really focused our efforts the past couple of weeks on making sure that we can reach members quickly. So building a list of their cell phone numbers. We're going to be working with the different caucuses to make sure that we can communicate with key staff, secretaries for the committees. So we're just going to try and be as flexible and agile as possible so that when things do rise up for the city, that we'll be able to respond to what's happening quickly. As you know, even with the $300 million they spent, they still are expecting the budget, the extra money, the surplus and reserves to be in the vicinity of 30 to 35% of the budget. Now, I believe that once the legislature assembles, they're going to start to spend that. And that's where it starts to become a concern from my perspective and what I'm hearing in my conversations with the Municipal League, legislative leadership, and the Legislative Finance Committee, is that as spending increases, then that's when the legislature starts to look for revenue. And from a city perspective, that's when the legislature may start to try and go back and revisit some issues that we've watched closely in the past. A couple of those that, and Sarita, I'm sorry if I'm getting ahead of myself, if I've left the special session conversation. Is that all right? Or do you want to pause and talk for a minute about the special? Or is it okay if I go on?
Joe, why don't we just take a quick pause to see if anyone has any questions for you about the special? I know it was quick and dirty and didn't really relate to us. So let me just give people a chance to raise their hands. I see none. I see nodding. So, okay, great. Thanks. So please go ahead.
So along the same lines of what we've been preparing for, there are 2 things that for Albuquerque where we feel like in the past few years, we've done really, really well. And that's a combination of participation from the council and the analysts, and then also leadership from the mayor's office. Mayor Keller is, his expertise as an auditor was in keeping an eye on capital dollars. And I feel like the city of Albuquerque is really leading the way in terms of how we've approached capital spending. And one of the things that we're hearing is that in this next session, there will be a severance tax bond package. Mr. Motzko from upstairs, and then a couple of the analysts from the council, we worked with the folks in the Legislative Council Service who are building the new individual capital outlay request forms. And I'm grateful to everybody on our team for our input in helping improve that form. I think they've come to rely on us for really doing it the right way and coming up with good projects and making sure they're adequately funded and properly devised. So we're getting great feedback in that front. That being said, if there's $110 million or $140 million in severance tax funding capacity, the question for us and the challenge for us is how do we compete for that money? How do we send the right message that we are picking the right projects that are timely for where we are in the world right now? And then also, how do we properly do that? And to the credit of everybody on this call, that's something I'm really proud of that the city has done. So I've reviewed the list of projects that Mr. Menicucci sent me, and I think it looks great. And I'll look forward to working with everybody to make sure we're putting our best foot forward. If you divide $110 million, which is what we're hearing it will be when you subtract out like the Water Trust Board and some of those funds that come off the top, if it's $110 million, that's not that much money. So the challenge for us is to be strategic in the requests that we make and the priorities we make. As you know, Madam Chair, I don't make policy and I don't improvise. So I will take the direction of leadership and folks on what you want us to pursue, and we'll try and do it the best possible way. Now, that being said, I always think there's an opportunity for us to try and make a statewide argument. And so, when you have that much money in reserves like they do, I think it's entirely possible there may be a small capital component that is sort of non-recurring general fund. So that's something that I think we need to maintain our flexibility on and make sure that we're able to compete if that opportunity arises. So that's capital. As it relates to bills, I don't know whether there's going to be a limitation on the number of bills that can be introduced. I know the House has discussed that as a way to try and keep the traffic down. But then I've also heard that the Senate's not really interested in that. So assuming that bills are popping up, I think one of our primary things as we sit and look at the way we review bills is we look for threats and we look for opportunities. And so in the past, the threats have really come in the form of tax stuff. So you'll recall we did pretty well a couple of years ago on the internet distribution stuff. But as the legislature spends more money and they start to try and look for revenue, you can imagine how they could go through and try and do repealers on some of these delayed effective dates. So I think that's the type of thing we're going to have to be very careful about. Pam Stokes up in Legislative Council Service is working on a tax bill. And that tax bill right now is mostly cleanup and has definitional changes and stuff in it. But as we know, those bills become vehicles for much larger threats. So we'll be watching that closely. Another one I'd like to flag for you is the Law Enforcement Protection Fund. We increased our distribution from 600 to 1,000, but that has a delayed effective date as well, I believe. And that's the type of thing where as they go through, they can start to monkey around with those things. So that would be on my list. Also, the Fire Protection Fund has some things that could possibly be altered. So we'll have to be mindful of them. The Water Conservation, it's called right now, that's a 3% or 3-cent charge per 1,000 gallons on produced water. That had been being administered by the Environment Department. It hasn't been well done. And so they're going to try and rebrand it. And it raises a policy question on whether they are able to raise rates that would then be passed on to the users, or if that's something the legislature should do. So that's an interesting question about, do you want to have the executive power to do it by regulation or have the legislature do it? I don't really know what your opinion is on that, but in general, it's nice for us to be able to talk with the folks that are actually making those changes. Then there's also talk about modifications to LEDA spending as it relates to whether you could use LEDA funds for retention rather than creating new jobs, but as a retention tool. That's something that we may need a policy read from the executive, from you all on. we're always watching the hold harmless stuff, although I'm not sure that that will be raised. So when you look at those issues, you can see how important it is that we are able to communicate with people and pick up intel on what's happening. For the last few years, I've had 2 assistants basically going around the Capitol anytime it's open, looking at outside committee rooms for agendas that are going up at the last minute. We're not going to be able to do that. So if we're having to rely on New Mexico legislative reports or on other things, you can imagine how important it's going to be for us to know what's going on so we can alert you so you can give us our direction. And I think that's going to be a major challenge for the legislature, is how they properly notice meetings and agendas so that the public is not deprived of their ability to participate as well. So those are the things that we're really focusing on right now. I've met with Mr. Menicucci and some of the counselors and staff, and I feel like they've got a good plan as it relates to how they're going to pursue their capital interests. And I really appreciate you all putting this document together, because it gives me the instruction, when legislators ask, this is the guiding document for us. But I'll stand for any questions, Madam Chair.
Thanks, Joe. Before we turn to the bill, any questions for Joe or Bianca? Okay, seeing none, let me give our other state lobbyist, Dave Jaramillo, a chance to weigh in here before we move to the bill.
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Joe is the money man for a reason, and he and Bianca and their team are just second to none on that. And I try to support them on the money issues by keeping in contact with our core. And Joe has talked about our core before, and that's our key allies in both chambers in the Albuquerque metro area. And, we're fortunate as a city to now have the pro tem being a solid ally of the interest of our citizens. And, new pro tem Stewart has just been solid for us in the past, and I think that's a positive. We're also, the hold harmless is always an issue that's on the radar of the Muni, and we're lucky that Chairman Javier Martinez is such a strong supporter. We have a good pipeline to him in terms of tax reform that we can keep our eyes on. On criminal justice issues, the VIP bill will be presented tomorrow through Chairman Chasey, and again, fortunate to have such a stalwart supporting our efforts as chair of that committee. And she actually does communicate very well with Chairman Cervantes on the Senate side. Joe and I have our own unique ability in ways of communicating with the chair, but it's, Chair Chasey always calms him in a lot of ways, and that's important, I think, very important. My understanding is it's going to be an entirely virtual session. I had spoken to the speaker before about the idea of the remote use of the convention center. I think that has been abandoned, and I think they are really hunkering down to the idea of a virtual session. And I think it's going to be key that we rely on our friendships with the core people that we just talked about in terms of finding out what the various changes on agenda will be, because Joe is absolutely right. I think we've affectionately called Joe's workers his Oompa Loompas in the past, and I love them to death, but we're not going to have that. So we're going to have to really rely on these committee chairs and their staff to communicate well with us. And Joe and I and his team will have our way of doing that. But it's going to be kind of crazy. I don't know, Joe can tell me whether he disagrees, but my guess is there won't be the volume of bills that we typically see in the 60-day, just because the bandwidth is not possible. And I think members will be more reluctant to introduce a bill, just streams of bills for the sake of having bills, because they just won't have lobbyists to help them educate other members and to support them on those bills. Maybe I'm hoping against hope on that, but I just think that's probably the truth. And that's a good thing for the city because that'll give us a lot of time to focus on the money issues and some of our policy issues without just sort of the hodgepodge that you see in the 60-day of every policy dream possible. So to live in strange times, that old proverb is true. And I don't know. I mean, I think the COVID numbers dipped again, and Grace said yesterday that it looks like it's leveling off. I doubt it's going to level off to a point where everybody's going to get comfortable that they're going to open those doors. I think there's, I've talked with Representative Eli about that at length. There's been some very heated conversations about the risks that that would pose, given the fact that there is a significant membership in both chambers that has a completely different view of the COVID risk. So I think they're going to go on the side of caution. The big unknown, and of course, is everybody is still waiting for President-elect Biden to fill out his cabinet. Everybody's read the papers that Governor Lujan Grisham is still in the top 2 for the HHS. And that's just a curveball that Joe and his team and I are ready for to pivot if and when we need to. But that is a real thing. It is an absolute real thing. And we'll just, we'll take that as it comes.
Thank you, David. Any questions for David? Okay, seeing none. We'll move on to our last agenda item, which is the state priorities bill. Would you like to start that conversation, Councilor Pena?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, we just worked with you, the administration and council staff to put together our state priorities bill. I've received a couple of calls from a couple of councilors that are still, maybe wanting to add something. So kind of I relate to everybody that, all the priorities or the requests need to be in by the time we submit this on Friday, because we'd like to have it heard at the council meeting on Monday so that we have, a solid document to move forward with. But other than that, I agree with everything Joe and David are saying. I think it's just going to be an interesting time for the state of New Mexico, just in general. I'm hearing a couple of numbers that are being thrown out there in terms of capital. And I've done a little bit of research of what we have been able to garner in the past. And last year, as you know, the veto pen was used, and I think we received about $39 million for city-related projects, and we ended up with the veto pen at about 17 million. So the remainder of that is what we received. Looking at the numbers in terms of potential capital this year, it seems like it's going to be a little lower than that, if anything, if things don't change, right? So, I think with the priorities that we have with the counselors, and obviously, UNM and CNM receive some of those same capital dollars from I think we have, and I want to thank Tom for helping me put this together, but I think there's like 30 some odd senators and representatives that directly represent the city of Albuquerque. So, I think it's just a matter of us, if there's that opportunity for capital, is just to be on it, and work with our lobbyists to ensure that we get those things funded. And then in terms of policy, the list is, the list you received has cannabis legislation. And I think, if I don't have the updated one, I think Tom added some COVID related statements in there just in case. Although I know we received the money from the federal government, I always think it's important to, put how, even when the governor is deciding how to spend the COVID money that the state receives, it's important to recognize the fact that here in Albuquerque, we have a regional impact in terms of our services that we provide to other communities. So we always need help to beef up those services that we have in terms of the homeless and substance abuse and other issues like that. And then one that I need to add is, and I was going to talk to the administration, because APD is doing that speeding for the state statute. Sorry. They can't find me one place, they find me in another place. But I think it would be important to add that in there as well, if the administration wants to do that. But other than that, I mean, everybody who's worked on this, I think, has done a great job. Tom, you know, folks from City Council, always working really hard, and I think it's a good document.
Thank you, Counselor. Any questions, comments? Counselor Benton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, you know, I fully support, you know, going ahead with a very finely sharpened agenda this time around, as far as what the city really cares about. I think we're doing great work regionally with the county and the university right now on the homeless issue, and that we really hard thought and focus to that. I like the fact that we're all being asked to limit our capital projects in the council districts to 3. I think that's the right number. And I'm very encouraged about the leadership of both houses of the legislature, and our Albuquerque-wide, or let's just call it metro-wide, because that's what we're really talking about, regional, if you wish, rail runner region, ability to get some things done for the urban areas. And these are the areas where we absorb the impact of behavioral health and addiction and everything else. And we're serving all the outer areas to a great extent. And we need some recognition for that. And we have a delegation right now that really is well positioned. And thank God for that, because we need, and during COVID and all these things that we're facing and the economic challenges of COVID, we really need to pull together with our region, you know, with Rio Rancho and Los Lunas and everybody, and say, we need some attention here. You know, we have, in terms of population, we're in a position to really do something. And I think, so I appreciated the comments from David and Thompson. I called you Mr. Horan. That shows I'm really getting too old. Or did I call you, David, Mr. Horan? Sorry. If I did, I'm sorry. But anyway.
I think Joe and I are a combination of Mr. Horan.
Well, that's what we like. We like having the twin, the leadoff hitters, the best ones up front. So, but no, I think it's a challenge and it's an opportunity with this session.
Thank you, Councillor Benton. Any other questions or comments? So I know Mr. Minicucci was really working down to the wire trying to get all of our items in here, and I'm not sure that everyone in the committee has had a chance to review the bill in detail. Councillor Pena, what's your pleasure? Do we want to go ahead and move this now and vote on it, or do we want to save that for next time? Sorry, you're still on mute.
Sorry. That glitch has started up again on my laptop. I would prefer to move it so that we can vote on it Monday so that we have a document, because we don't have another council meeting after that. So that would lead us into January, which I don't think is necessarily a good idea. So I'd like to, other than I think that there might be a few minor adjustments, and what I can do is once we have it finalized before the submittal time Friday at, Friday at 5, I think is our deadline to submit legislation. I can send it out to everyone just to ensure that everyone's had a 3 o'clock. Councillor Benton saying 3 o'clock. So that we can review it at that point and then just move it on to council, because I'd hate to just be adding a bunch of amendments at council, if that's okay with everyone. Yeah.
Sounds great. We'll take that as a motion. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Councillor Davis, saw you first. Thank you. I did receive some amendments, so would we like to move those now as well, Mr. Rael or Mr. Pedia?
Madam Chair and members of the committee, we made a couple of slight expansions on language to the document that Tom had sent down. And so I don't know if one of you, maybe Isaac, could you do a screen share, or Tom, maybe on the amendments that I sent up? It might be easier for everyone to see them.
You're on mute, Tom. Tom, you're on mute.
I don't know, Julian, are you able to hear us? It's being run by Julian Moya. We can do screen share.
Yeah, I just allowed access for anybody to do it. So if you have it, Isaac, you should be able to do share screen.
Okay. If not, I'll have it in a second.
Okay, this is the one, right, Lawrence?
Yes.
Okay.
Just really quick, just to go through the list here. Albuquerque Museum Phase 2 was the way Tom had set it up, and I think that reads fine. The next one was the Balloon Fiesta 50th anniversary. We just added language to Tom's language here that adds transportation facilities as well, simply because we're looking at not just park and rides, but lighting in terms of intersections and the ability to move traffic. So just wanting to expand the scope of the project so that as money becomes available, we can have flexibility. Gateway centers, just shortened up the definition just to say develop multiple gateway and triage centers, period. Then the next one is, we just redid completely. It was, we inadvertently labeled it incorrectly when we sent it down to Tom. So it's really the Downtown Rail Trail, and it's a multi-use trail connecting the rail yards to the convention center and to the Glorieta Station, which is the development project there that abuts Lomas on the north end of the corridor, if you will. And so the definition that was there and the project that was there was not the one we had requested funding for. We left rail yard improvements as it was. Real-time crime center stayed the same. Shot spotter and gun intelligence said the same. We just modified a little bit. The next one, multi-purpose event / soccer stadium, and just broaden the scope a little bit, just simply so that it has a little bit more appeal, if you will, to the community and to the legislators, in that it will be a soccer stadium if it's approved, but there could be other uses for that, for other sporting activities or other uses as we see down the road. And then the West Side Indoor Sports Facility, instead of calling it a multi-use facility, I didn't want to get that. I didn't want the confusion with the soccer stadium, so we modified it a bit just to say West Side Indoor Sports Facility, just to clarify what it is. But that is the list that we modified this morning. So stand for any questions from any of the members of the committee.
Mr. Rayo, before we move to that, may I just suggest a friendly edit? ShotSpotter is a brand name. It's like saying we want to buy a Xerox copier. Can we just change that to shot detection? And then,
Yeah.
and then if you'd like to move this, we can get it on the table for discussion.
I would accept your friendly recommendation that is correct. It is, and change the title on top as well, whoever is doing the editing. So that it's gun detention or shot detection, I guess. And with that, Madam Chair, I would move approval of the amendments.
Thank you. We have a motion. Do I see a second? Councilor Davis with a second. Any discussion, questions, comments?
I'd like to make a comment, Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilor Pena.
I just want to say this shot detection, I don't know what other councilors have it in their area. I know they're not at liberty to discuss where they've put them, but I know one of them covers the Alamosa area, and boy, oh boy, has it made a difference. The response in the police coming out here. I mean, we hear the gunshots. Obviously, you guys know where I live, and the gunshots on a regular basis. And now as soon as you hear them, shortly after, the police are out and on it. So I just think that this is incredible, and I hope we can get lots more dollars to do this throughout the city of Albuquerque.
Thank you, Councilor. Totally agreed. Any other comments?
Madam, oh, no, mind. No, never mind, Madam Chair. My apologies.
Okay. All right. Councilor Benton, I see your hand up in participants.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I would just, just the suggestion, and we can amend this at council in terms of just some minor things. So maybe it doesn't matter right now, but to me, the term gateway centers doesn't mean anything to the audience here. What we're talking about are the things that the Homeless Coordinating Council is talking about, and maybe we could lift some language more from what has already been done there. I know Gateway Center is still being used as a term, but maybe we just put a generic name, naming of that function for now, as opposed to gateway. That is a concern that I have.
Thank you, Councilor. Mr. Rael, what about something like gateway centers for homelessness, maybe, just to make it clear what those are? You want to do any wordsmithing here?
I mean, Madam Chair and Councilor, that sounds fine to me. I get your perspective in terms of just that gateway center sort of could be anything. So I think that's fine.
Madam Chair, I don't have the exact suggestion, but I think we could work on that, and we could pass this knowing that terminology, which is good, and I understand what it is, but not everybody does, and I think the majority of the people don't know what we mean by that. So we could hammer on that a little bit, and in the interest of not having a bunch